Welcome to Budget Outlaws. This episode is going to be dedicated to paint. I'm going to discuss how I painted my Porsche 914 and a few other cars, and what things I learned along the way that would make things easier and nicer for future paint projects. Stay tuned to the end to hear how I would do things differently now. So, how did I go from this to this? The short answer is time, patience, and work. To start with, I had previously painted my car a couple different times with flat black aerosol lacquer cans. While this was a great way to achieve the hot rod look I was going for, it was a very bad idea for me in the future when I went to actually give it a proper paint job. You see, lacquer doesn't really ever dry. This meant that sanding the primer out to get some good paint or steel or the fiberglass gel coat on my fenders took considerably more time and consumables. Doing this paint job on a budget, I went to Harbor Freight and grabbed some foam sanding blocks. I was also not looking to flatten these rounded, contoured areas on the top of the fenders, so I didn't want to use a DA sander. A couple of hours per panel with the 80 grit sanding blocks, and the body lacquer was starting to come off. Luckily, this was also showing me the low spots. The spots that have the black primer still on means that it's the low spot, aka a spot that will need to have either high build primer, plastic filler, or glazing putty put on it to bring it up to where it needs to be. You can see in this crude Microsoft Paint drawing that the black line is the desired body line that we want. The red line is the actual body line that we have, and then the yellow area would be some kind of filler. This is a low spot. There are a few ways to fix low spots. One is with moving actual metal with, say, a hammer or dolly. And if, for example, we had a high spot, one would put that dolly behind the high spot and hit the metal with a hammer to push it in place. This works sometimes and requires a high level of skill. If, for example, we have low spots, one would go from inside the panel and hit the spot with a hammer. It helps to absorb the blow with either a small dolly on another area of the panel or with a bag of sand. In the case of a bag of sand, you would actually be stretching the metal, and in the case of a small dolly, you would be moving the metal around and potentially shrinking the metal. So you have to be careful, and as I mentioned, it takes quite a lot of skill and practice. In our case here, we have grafted fiberglass fenders, and this technique doesn't work as the fenders cannot be worked like metal, and we are to resort to a filler of some kind. Luckily, the panels are of very nice quality and only require 1 or 10 applications of glazing putty. The more time spent prior to the application of paint to get everything perfect, the better the end results can be. Comment below if there's a technique you want me to go over more in detail on this video. I'm glossing over some of these things pretty generally, but would be happy to revisit them if there was enough interest in the details of the how-to. So we found some very low spots that needed filling. So we bring out the body filler and we get to work. The ratio on this is typically 1 golf ball size of filler to an inch line of hardener. You'll know if you didn't put enough, as it won't set up after an hour or 2 hours depending on the temp, or if you put too much, as it hardens while you're trying to apply it a minute after you mix it. You can give it less or more time for mixing based on the ratio of hardener you use and the temperature outside. The hotter it is outside, the less hardener to a point, and vice versa. Most products are designed for a 70-degree ambient temp guide, including paint, primer, etc., per the instructions. Mix filler on a flat, non-porous board. Plastic is my preference, with an applicator. You want to draw a X multiple times, basically, and then circle the material, always keeping the filler on one side of the applicator. Once it's mixed and the color is consistent, you're ready to go. Now, applying the filler to a flat panel is easy. Simply scrape the material off the working board and onto the low spot. Then gently scrape the low spot a few times in multiple directions to get the material worked in. Don't push down too hard, as you want some material to sand off, and ensure you didn't put too little on the panel, or you'll have to reapply it over again. If you're sanding body filler down and you have a lot to sand, you can use what's called a body filler file. It helps take off a lot of material at once. I've used this, and while it does work, it is very easy to go too far. I would only use this if you plan to lay a few more applications of filler afterwards. It's a much easier to start with, say, 80 grit paper to roughen your bodywork than use, say, 120 grit or 180 grit. I personally used 80 grit prior to my first application of primer. I found that I needed to glaze a large area, and I didn't want to go full strength on body filler. I wanted to move more quickly than just glazing putty. I found I would often mix the fillers to get my desired consistency. For example, I had such a large flat area on my trunk that I decided it was best to just glaze the entire panel and then sand from there. It worked really well and let me get the trunk lid very flat with relatively little work. Yes, there's about a 1/16 of an inch filler over the panel, and I probably could have used high build primer, but I was limited in tools and didn't have a high build primer or a large tip primer gun. A long wood block is great for making sure your panel is nice and flat, and I probably use this $15 Harbor Freight block more than any other tool by a long shot. But a nice pneumatic longboard can speed up the process quite rapidly. Note, I would not use it for final sanding after guide coat unless you are very familiar with the tool. Now, it's time to discuss primer. I used a $10 Harbor Freight 1.4 tip paint gun. This was definitely a mistake, but I was able to make it work. I had to thin down the primer substantially just to get it to come out of the gun. I would use a 1.8 to 2.2 tip gun for primer now. Also, make sure you use a dedicated gun for primer. This is essential. You don't want the contaminants on the primer gun to mix in with the paint gun. Even though you are going to clean it really well, it's just better to have a dedicated paint gun and a dedicated primer gun. Now, mix the primer per the instructions. I always go a tiny bit extra for hardener and get an extra bit of hardener at the store. Adjust the gun and get a couple of good practice hits with the primer gun. You want to make sure that the gun is feeding correctly. The paint is laying down smooth and in a nice fan pattern. Put the gun 12 to 18 inches away from the panel and spray in a nice smooth motion, starting and stopping the flow of paint from the gun off the panel, aka squeeze the trigger when you're not pointing at the panel, paint the panel, and then keep the trigger squeezed until you're completely off the panel and then let off. If you're doing the whole side of the car, now is a great time to practice walking the length of the car. I typically go 1 foot behind the other to keep my pace smooth. Once a car has one layer of primer, don't overdo this primer as you don't want it to run. A nice light coat is perfect. Give it some flash time, about 10 minutes is fine, and go at it with a couple more coats to build up your layers. Again, I used a thin tip gun, so I had to do quite a few layers to build up any material at all. If you have a 1.8 or 2.2 tip gun with a high build 2K primer, then you probably can just get away with 1 or maybe 2 coats of primer, because it does lay down a lot of material. After a day for dry time, then a simple spritz of black paint just misted over the panel will give you a nice guide coat. You don't need much, and when you sand, you'll notice a difference in color between the fresh primer and the layer underneath anyways. Sand in a cross hatch motion along the body lines, aka keep your long board horizontal and move it diagonally up and down. Then opposite diagonally like you're drawing an X. Never go the direction of the board as you'll take away too much material. Always at a cross angle. Keep going till you're going through the primer to the layer underneath and stop, or to the point that you've sanded all the guide coat off. If you get to the point that you sanded the primer completely off in spots and then the low areas still have a guide coat, they will need to be roughed sanded by hand and either filled with a high build primer or some kind of filler. Prime again, and you'll notice things start to look better. Guide coat the paint and keep repeating the process until you get it where you want. I personally do one side of the car at a time. It helps to move quicker and develop motivation. It's nice to see a product come to fruition very quickly. One thing I found with my fiberglass fenders was that I had some spots where the blending of the fender was too thin and I needed to cut out the fender and fill it. I used a product called kitty hair, plus some filler to thin it out. Kitty hair is essentially body filler with small fiberglass strands mixed in. This worked really well. 10 years later, I still don't have any cracks here, and I step on this area from time to time. I also use this to develop a hard body line and any other spot that needed some serious amount of filler or strength. I had quite a bit of fiberglass work to do to the rear bumper, so I'll go through that real quickly. I would cut reliefs in the bumper to fit them better and then get them to where I want. Kind of push the bumper in position or stretch the bumper out, whatever I ended up needing to do, and then reinforce everything with kitty hair and keep the bumper stretched or whatever needed to happen until it's dried, and then sand off the kitty hair, and I'm left with a bumper that is in the position that I wanted to. I had to do this a couple times, but it ended up working really well for what was an ill-fitting fiberglass piece. After the first layer of primer and the body is sufficiently straight, which means free of high and low spots, then you'll want to start increasing your paper grit. 120, 180, 220, 320. You can make bigger jumps if things aren't going well, like 80 to 180 and 320, but it's not terribly difficult to go over a panel in one grit for a couple of passes. It ensures that you have taken away all the lower grit scratches, and if you're painting with metallics or similar, you want to bump that final number up to 600, but don't go over that. The paint has to have something to grab to. One thing to note is that if you're painting in your garage, make sure you have proper ventilation. Priming with a door open is one thing, but when you get to color, and especially clear, you fog up the area really quickly. Always make sure you use a fresh mask when painting color. An old mask is okay for primer, but a fresh mask is required for color. I've used the Harbor Freight $15 masks with the double canisters successfully, and I'm still living and breathing today. But I would not use an old mask when doing color. A tip for those 914 guys: be sure to get those hard to reach areas first. Plan your attack before priming with a gun and hose, so you know what leaning you have to do, stretching, walking path, etc. You don't want to have a really great paint session ruined by having your body or hose reel touch the work. Another thing is that you will need a nice workstation that is laid out and all tools are prepped ahead of time. Cans are opened with lids on them. Any materials you need are there ahead of time, and if you have to mix a little bit more paint or primer, it's there. Also, a spare gun is handy if one you're working with clogs up or starts messing up mid-shoot. Start with running acetone through it first and thinning out your material slightly more, but it's good to have a spare. You want to make sure you have something to dump used material into, and then something to hold your gun while you're mixing or pouring the material. I started with a big glass pitcher. It could hold my gun when needed due to the spout, and I would drop any excess material in it after painting and while cleaning. Be sure you have plenty of lint-free rags and acetone ready for cleanup. I would buy acetone by the gallon and typically keep a couple of them. Now you are ready to spray. A great way to test spray is to spray the undersides of the trunk and hood It's not essential to get these right, and they should be sprayed. I tested with the top of my car. It was a target top. This let me determine how many coats was too many coats and how my flash time needed to be at that temp. As you can see, I had a couple of runs, but I dealt with those later. Next, I went to the rear trunk, needing a bit more practice, and the engine lid. A good thing about single stage, solid color paints is that you can spray pieces in multiple days and time, and the color will be 99% the same, so long as the base metal has the same color primer. As I mentioned about difficult to reach areas, it's a good idea to get these done first. I did under my target bar the day before I did the whole paint job, and then just blended the hard line. You can do this with the door jambs and door insides at the same time if needed. I wasn't doing a color change, so it wasn't needed in this case. Car was all masked up, garage floor is wet down, and everything is cleaned. Wetting down the garage floor helps prevent dust from getting picked up while walking. First layer of paint goes on, and it's a do what I say, not what I do about walking the car. I didn't walk the car, and as such, later on, I got a couple of runs where I did the fender, door, fender separately versus one long pass. I shot 7 to 8 layers of paint, which also attributed to a couple of runs, but being single stage, it was just a matter of sanding them out with a high grit paper and polishing the panel. The results stand for themselves. The paint turned out very well. My cost and materials are difficult to calculate at this point, but I spent about $200 in paint, $200 in primer and body filler. I used about 4 gallons of primer on this car since I primed it about 5 times, and that stuff's just not cheap. The sandpaper was about $200. The polishing compound and various tools was another $100. Note I had a good air compressor, but if I didn't, one would need to spend about $150 for that. All in all, the prep work is where the quality is. I spent maybe 300 hours on this paint job, start to finish, and coming from riveted on fenders to a molded, very nice looking body kit is pretty substantial. I would have never been able to pay someone to do this work, and the time spent led me to quite a bit of pride and workmanship. I painted another 914s similarly and had quite a bit of body work, and that car I did in 125 hours, including the buffing and sanding of the paint. Now this is a garage paint job, and 10 years later it still does not look like it. I haven't done a cut buff job on it since the first one, but I have enough material on it to be able to. There are 1 or 2 spider cracks that have developed, but that's only been in this last year, and they are only about 1/4 inch long, to be expected when bonding fiberglass to steel. I'm really proud of the work, as it's drawn some decent attention, including the shot of Magnus Walker taking a picture of the car last year. He posted it on his Instagram page a while ago. So, if you've stuck around this long, maybe you're interested in what I would have done differently now that I've painted another 3 cars since. For starters, I would have sanded down all the black primer off, not just most of it. Then I would have put down 1 tinted layer of primer sealer. Tinting the primer would tell me not to sand beyond that layer. I would do body filler on top of that and put down a high build 2K primer from a 1.8 to a 2.2 tip primer gun. This would have saved me quite a bit of work with priming and sanding. I would continue with blocking and fixing minor imperfections and then paint it just like I did. Another thing that I would change is I would have used a DA sander more than I did for the initial sanding of the primer. DA sander works really well for getting a lot of material off, and it actually sands pretty flat. You just have to be really careful with the edge of it. Let me know what you think. What would you do differently had you been me? What tips do you have for newbie painting cars? If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And if you want to get notifications of our latest videos, hit the bell button. Thank you for your support. Bye-bye.